of anime. When Akira came out, I saw it. I thought it was fantastic. But the boys opened my eyes to it. The Wachowski brothers showed me Ghost in the Shell, and they showed me what they wanted to do with that type of action and photography and try to make it with real people, with real actors, and create a hybrid.
その表現の方法としても日本の漫画で、よく使われるカッティングであるとか絵作り、アニメーションの中で使われる演出、香港のワイヤーアクションの、独特な世界観、こういったですね世界中のあらゆるさまざまな映像の素材というのをかなり高い次元で融合させて、それをなおかつライブアクションでやってしまったというのがですね非常に衝撃でした。
アニメーションを見てるような感覚で見ていましたね。
It seemed like they were animating their actors the way an animating would manipulate an animated character.
やっぱりそのカット割りだとかね、そういうとこでっていうところがやっぱり非常に、不安にもさせてくれたね。
それを見せられたらまたそれに負けないような映像を作りたいなっていう風な、意欲も湧いてくるし、いろんな意味で、影響あった作品だと思います。
I remember someone said to me, "The movie is so Japanese," and then I remember when I was in Spain, they said the movie is so Spanish. But I of course think it's very Jewish, but that's where I'm from. We went to Japan in September of '99 after the movie opened to do a Japanese press junket.
ラリー&アンディがですね日本に来た時に彼らが見たい場所というのがテレビゲームの開発会社の、スタジオの中を見たい。
At the same time, meet all the Japanese anime directors and all the entities that do the Japanese anime because they were fans and we were trying to figure out a way to use it.
当然そのアイディアも非常にたくさんのさまざまなアイディアも浮かぶんですが、何よりもその日本のですねこういった漫画であるとかアニメーションであるとかフィギュアであるとかそういったポップカルチャーの部分をとてもよく日本人以上に研究して知り尽くしていると。
We found this terrific talent, a very talented guy named Mike Arias, who was actually a friend of John Gaeta, who was our head of visual effects on Matrix movies. And we met Mike, and he is an American guy living in Japan.
I took him over to Studio 4 Degrees, which is where we've ended up doing most of the Animatrix.
これはね、すごく記念すべき、私にもすごい楽しい話なんだけれども、マトリックスを公開するときにジョエル・シルバーさんとアンディ・アンドラリー・ウォシャクスキーさんがアロハシャツで、それでサンダル履きでペタペタペタとこのスタジオに遊びに来てくれたんですね。
I think they were just really feeling the situation out.
We had the opportunity to really incorporate traditional anime in some fashion that would incorporate elements of the story in a new way. And we didn't know how to do it at first. We thought maybe we'd do a television show. We thought maybe we might do one anime feature.
I ended up spending the whole week with these guys and seeing The Matrix for the first time at the Japanese premiere. And, you know, I was blown away, too. It was very, who are these guys? Where did they come from? And how did John Gaeta pull this off? Like a total slacker.
I remember on the plane ride back, Larry sat down with a yellow pad and kind of mapped out this scheme that we would do where we would have the movie and a video game and these animated stories and how they would all kind of interact together. And we made the decision to do a series of 9 or 10 short animated tales, yarns that would be in and around the Matrix.
When we first started, it was very much 10 6-minute episodes. Now it's like 9 episodes and they're anywhere between 6 minutes and 16 minutes.
The boys and I wanted to wreck these episodes. They wanted to find high-end Japanese animation directors who could bring to the table their own style and their own ideas. The brothers wrote 4 of the episodes themselves and collaborated with the directors on the other episodes.
I've been very impressed by how open they are to other people's ideas.
They really wanted to give them the freedom to make these stories their own. And I think they did that because they're all coming from the same place, but they approach it all so differently.
今までですね、これ日本だけではなく海外も含めてこれだけビッグでこれだけの監督さんたちを一堂に集めたプロジェクトというのはありませんでした。
Larry and Andy appreciate the history of Japanese anime. They revel in it. They love animation. So Japanese anime is probably one of the most significant influences on them and on these movies. I mean, Japanese anime is not a new thing. I mean, it's been around forever.
The modern Japanese comic is a fusion of two things. It's a fusion of Western form, which is basically the grammar for modern comic books, which was developed in the United States. That was fused onto an indigenous tradition, goes back hundreds, even 1,000 years, of art that entertains, and it's mainly line art.
That manga are really an outgrowth or just the sort of modern expression of the same artistic vibes that inspired the great ukiyo-e, the Japanese woodblock printmakers of the 19th and 18th centuries, and even before that, the old Buddhist scroll makers.
You'd unroll them from right to left, and as you unroll them, there would be a story that would unfold. And then later on, you had the emergence of woodblock prints, which were a way to mass-produce visual art, and they depicted more popular subjects, often such as kabuki actors, natural scenes, but they were also compiled into books and used to tell stories in sequence, so they were very similar to today's comics in many senses.
But then they, in the 1920s, I think it was, they discovered the funnies in America. They started drawing, story comics as opposed to these one-panel things.
All the forms of Japanime out there, you have this constant interest in history. Many of the primary works are historically based. So it becomes a reflection of history and a reflection on history. And all of this comes out of a greater search for identity at the heart of all this work. Anime rose directly out of the post-war situation in Japan after World War II, specifically out of manga comics.
I think there are a lot of reasons that comic book culture, manga culture exploded after the war. One of them, I think, had to do with the pent-up demand for entertainment, because people had been living under a lot of privation and they'd been suffering a lot.
Most of the theaters in metropolitan Japan were gone. Movies might be displayed on a white wall of a building with chairs laid outside. The Japanese movie industry in the late 40s was virtually non-existent.
There were some artists who appeared at this time. The most famous one of all is Osamu Tezuka, who's regarded as the sort of god of manga and anime. He took the American comic book format and he started experimenting with it, and he developed a much more visually oriented style that drove the kids wild in Japan.
You would have action that would just kind of leak into the next panel and then permeate the next one. So your eye is kind of traveling at a faster rate.
He took many of the things that he saw in Disney animation or even Max Fleischer animation, and many of those elements, and tried to sort of replicate them on the physical page. And as a result, many of his early characters look very much like Max Fleischer characters and even early Disney characters. At the beginning of the 50s on, the kids who were reading manga kept reading them as they aged, and the industry increasingly targeted them, and the market expanded and expanded.
And now, any genre you'll find in literature. Hard-boiled detective, sappy love stories, science fiction, fantasy tales, straight adventure stories, stories about everyday life.
They put every subject matter into comic books. We have a tendency here to think that, if it's not Archie comics or superhero comic books, well, what could it possibly be?
They're manga about, loan sharks. They're manga about housewives. They're mangas about, people who are unemployed, office workers.
There's mahjong ones, right? And then you have a grappler fighting one.
And some are for females and some are for males. It's like broken up that way, but then there's ones for kids, ones for adults, ones for perverts.
Like all these topics that you wouldn't imagine are popular, but everybody reads them.
Manga are a true mass medium, and when Americans and Europeans look at manga, one of the problems they have is they're often viewing them in the context of comic books, which are such a mini market in the United States.
You can go on the subway in Japan and you'll see anybody from 6 to 60 sitting there, huddled tightly against the other people reading their book, and nobody looks down at them, which I find always amusing here because, the same people that throw their nose up at you going, oh, you mean comic book, are the same people who go to action movies up to the age of 50, you go action movies are just comic books, really, when you get right down to it.
So it's a huge industry, and it's a huge part of Japanese culture that's hard for people outside of Japan to understand.
It really began what we think of as anime with Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy. That was a Pinocchio story.
Tezuka put together a production studio to create a TV animation. So he created the first Japanese black and white TV animation in 1963 and followed that very quickly with the first full color animation series, which we know in the United States is Kimba the White Lion.
Early animation in every country has to cut corners like any commercial product. You have to do things in a way that meets your budget. So Tezuka developed a marvelous sequence of things which would give an impression of motion and action and things.
Which now we call limited animation. The more drawings you have in a second, the smoother the action will look. So they've come up with all kinds of ways to limit the amount of time for which smooth motion has to be created as a way of lowering the production costs.
And you might have a very large drawing and the camera might physically pan over this one drawing. You have motion as the camera pans over the drawing. You don't have a huge number of cells painted by people.
かなり短期間に作るということですよね。ローバジェットで短期間に作ることには長けてると思います。
That's the one thing that the Japanese do way grander than us, is that they figured out how to cheat your way, if you will, through the process, and in the good moments actually convince you that they weren't cheating.
It often looks just like reading manga. Often the frames are semi-frozen. Characters don't move as rapidly as, say, Disney animation.
And you find poses and angles from which the characters look good, and you play to those and use dialogue and cutting and the settings more than an American director might.
If you slide static images, it looks like things are moving because the perspective of your eye changes as you come up over a hill. And as you turn a corner, everything moves on you. So if you move something in the background and you move the people in the middle ground and everything's going like this at a different rate, you see motion. Motion equals animation.
There's more emphasis on close-ups of faces, the sort of freezing of the frame where you're focusing on the eyes and the emotion. A lot of Americans look at Japanese animation and Japanese comics and they are sort of puzzled by the look of the characters. They often have big eyes and they often look Caucasian, and that's partly due to some of the techniques that Tezuka established. His model was really American animation.
These anime babes, they have the same big eyes, the same voluptuous figure, and they're cute and bouncy and speaking squeaky little voices just like Betty Boop.
Where did she come from? There's cross-pollination now, you know, I think it's somewhat similar. I mean, Astro Boy has 2 points on his head, like Mickey Mouse had 2 ears.
One tip-off watching a Japanese film is if the character has large eyes, he or she is probably on the good side. If they've got small eyes, they are probably not, because they're not sensitive. It's very much the windows of the soul.
It's nothing to do with Japan at all. It's just a convention that was established.
It's anime style.
You get sequences in which there seems to be very little action going on. They have these beautiful slow moments that are very atmospheric because they want to.
Historically in Japan, there's been this emphasis on the non-stated, on the vacuum space, and on the frozen element. So even in Japanese novels, there's a lot of emphasis on implied meaning. And part of that comes out of the language. This Japanese language relies so heavily on implied meaning. There are many things that are not directly stated.
引き算ですね。そうそう。アメリカの方が足し算だとすると日本のそういうものの表現ってなんか伝統的に引き算がかっこいいみたいなところがあると思うんですよね。言い過ぎはかっこよくないとか。
I kind of regard the individual drawings in an animated film almost like brush strokes in a painting, and traditional Western art is interested in creating an illusion of nature, whereas traditional Eastern painting is more about the gesture of the painter.
And they use a lot of speed lines and motion, and they just want you to believe that that guy's running a million miles an hour, that guy's flying. Where here, when you do Spider-Man, You know, we have a tendency in Superman to show the building behind them to still create the illusion, and we don't necessarily have the confidence maybe in our audience that, you know, we established them jumping out of the building 2 panels ago, that they're still flying. We don't have to show it every panel.
One of the delicious tropes of anime, which I think is a direct influence on the Matrix,